Let's go. I'm officially recording.
You want us to start?
Yeah, we'll get started. Go ahead, Mike. We'll start with you, Michael.
I'm Michael Winter. I'm the chief coffee maker at Bray Oakley Insurance Agency.
That's true on so many different levels. And since he's
vice president,
yeah, go ahead.
Also known as vice president.
Also known as vice president. Got it. Danny, you want to go?
Yeah, I'm Danny Crum. I'm the sales manager at Bray Oakley Insurance. When Michael's not around to make coffee, I fill in for him.
That's good.
That sounds good.
I'm Claude Singleton. I manage the Lexington office and the Richmond office in Kentucky.
Great. Well, I'm BG and Mike is with us here. And of course, we're just going to be talking about insurance together. We're just here to help facilitate the conversation with you guys. And I'm excited about learning more about insurance, both personally and for those who might be watching or listening on a podcast or watching on YouTube. So flood insurance is the topic today. So I guess we can start chatting about that. And it's big on people's minds and hearts right now in Kentucky. And so we could just start with the questions that people are asking. What are the main differences between an NFIP and private flood insurance for folks who are interested in knowing more about it? Whoever wants to take that.
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a question we get all the time. Private flood is becoming very popular. Used to, all you had was FEMA, which, the NFIP is the National Flood Insurance Program. It accounts for the vast majority of policies written, and it's backed by the Federal Emergency Management Agency, which everyone knows is FEMA. And before, that's pretty much what was offered to you. Now, some of these private companies are coming out with their own flood insurance, which is the private flood carriers, and it's starting to take storm. It's new, but it's catching hold. It's almost like, you can purchase insurance from State Farm or Erie Insurance or State Auto or whoever, and these private carriers are now offering flood insurance. Pretty good stuff.
So some of the differences that we started noticing was we're used to the NFIP program. We were very hesitant on looking at the private carrier flood program because there was some ambiguity with how did they respond? There was some language that lenders didn't want to accept the private carriers because there was a bunch of kind of technical issues that weren't getting worked out, and then they passed this Bigger Waters Act, which allowed banks to accept the private flood insurance carriers. A lot of the difference we noticed in it is that the building values, private flood carriers can offer higher building limits. The NFIP program, it's a set limit. They have $250,000 on the structure, and I think it's a limit of $100,000 on contents.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
NFIP has to insure in all states and all the communities that the flood insurance program operates in, so they have to be a little bit restrictive. The private flood carriers, they can pick and choose which areas they want to provide flood insurance to, so they can actually pick the good areas and offer better rates. And they can by offering better rates, they can offer even additional coverages.
Yeah. The private flood is much more broad. And this all began and just to get a little history of flood insurance, in 1968, FEMA, the flood maps were created, and Congress actually passed the National Flood Insurance Act, which it allowed banks and things to require homeowners that were in flood zones to carry flood insurance. And so you're seeing a lot of that now, especially in rural areas like West Virginia and things. But the private flood is somewhat more broad than what FEMA offers, like Michael was saying. Typically, you can get up $500,000 in coverage compared to $250,000, sometimes higher. Loss of use is a big coverage that the private flood offers compared to FEMA, which means just like if you lose your home to a house fire, your insurance carrier will actually usually provide you loss of use, meaning they're going to put you up in a place to live, provide you some monies and things to do that. Well, private flood carriers typically do too. So there's a lot more broad per se than what the FEMA offers. That don't mean it's better. It's just, sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. It just depends on the risk, really.
I think something Michael said is important on the private carrier flood insurance. If they feel they've got a niche and they can take advantage of it, they do that. And in doing so, they're more competitive. And in general, the pricing is lower in general, again, because they don't have to take everything. As Michael said, with the National Flood Insurance Program, they're taking everything. So they've got to take a terrible amount of risk and try to balance that out across the nation, really. But the private carriers can choose, and then within areas, actually pick out a street that's on one area that gets an even better rate. It's right next door to another street, but it's because of the flow and the slightly greater altitude or whatever, it's got that much less of a chance of getting flooded out. And so people on that street will enjoy a better rate than their neighbor just a street over even. It's amazing how the private carriers can do a good job with that. And if you can qualify for the private carrier, I think you're better off. Probably the best thing would be, I can give you a commercial right here. Give us a call and we will be glad to run a quote for you. There's no obligation for that, but let us know. We'll be glad to do that.
Yeah, that's a good point. One of the big selling points with private flood compared to FEMA is what's called flood elevation certificates. So if you're being insured with under FEMA, the National Flood, then if you're in a certain flood zone, they're requiring you to have what's called an elevation certificate. And what that is a surveyor will actually come out and they'll survey your home in relation to the flood zone, meaning they'll measure to the first floor of the home, second floor of the home, what kind of foundation you have, and where your home sits to the floodplain. All right, so that can actually help you. Sometimes it can hurt you, but with the private flood carriers, all you need is a determination. And that means, and you can find that through most banks or online, it will give you usually the flood zone A, B, C, D, X, whatever. And if you've got that, they'll provide you an accurate quote without having that elevation certificate. Again, an elevation certificate is not always a bad thing. Sometimes it's good. It depends, especially in rural areas like ours. I had a client one time, and here's your little story, that he had flood insurance. And it can get very expensive in rural areas, like I was saying, and he was paying a whole lot for it. Well, he called me about homeowners insurance. So I was out inspecting his home, and I noticed around the bottom of the house, there were some really nice fascia blocks. Everything looked really pretty. The home was up in the air. And I said, Keith, I was like, did you raise your home up? He said, yeah, we got flooded 4 years ago. Mm-hmm. And so I had someone come in and raise my home up. I mean, it was set probably 6 feet up, one-story home. And I said, how'd that help with your flood insurance? He said, what do you mean? I said, did you call your agent and tell them that you raised your home? And he said, no, I didn't think about it. I was like, well, there's a good chance that now your home being raised up, you may not be in the flood zone like you were in relation to the floodplain. He said, I never thought about it. So he and I got on the phone and we got a surveyor out there, and he was paying about $5,000 a year for flood insurance. It was crazy. Once they done the survey and I requoted his flood insurance, it went down to $1,400. Wow. And so needless to say, he was extremely happy. We were extremely happy, but that's just part of what we do, because we look at all of our risks that we insure. We go out and look at the home, we do the measurements, we get photos and all that stuff. And we try to do a good job for our clients. And, anytime you can help somebody, it's always better for them and us. I'll never lose this guy. He'll always be with us.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
We'll send somebody out from all of your locations to do that?
Yes, we do. Not for flood insurance. We do inspect some flood risk, but any home that we insure within the agency that's with a standard carrier, we put feet on the ground. We look at it. We go out because, I was talking to a young lady in Richmond today, and she's young. She's, I think, 29 years old, master's nursing, travel nurse, good job. And she's purchasing close to $500,000 home. And she had got some quotes in other areas, right? And so I get to ask her all these questions. And I was like, Sydney, what's your square foot? Well, I don't know, and all this. I said, well, how many quotes have you had? She said, well, I've had 5. I said, has anybody came out and looked at it, measured it, asked you any square foot? No, they just got on the internet and looked the home up, and that's what they're providing me quotes by. So I get a little deeper into that. And I'm like, so what are they coming back with for your coverage A, which is the replacement cost of the dwelling? it was almost half of what she's purchasing the home for. I said, do you realize what's going on here? And she's like, no. I said, well, they're offering you decent quotes as far as premium goes, but you're underinsured. You're not protecting your risk. And she's like, what do you mean? I was like, well, you're at 300, you're purchasing a home for $400,000 or $500,000, and they're coming back with $250,000 coverage. And she said, well, I didn't realize that. And I said, well, and that's why we do what we do. This happens all the time. It happens all the time. We go out, we measure our houses, we take pictures. We know what we're insuring because a home is the largest investment that most people make.
Yeah.
And let me tell you something. I've been in the insurance business for 10 years, and I've had clients that have had total losses. It's devastating, and you don't realize what you lose until you go through something like that. It could absolutely affect their lives so negatively, it could just change everything. So, we take it personal, and to this day, knock on wood, everything that I've done or I've had a claim, I have clients that call me crying, weeping, and thank you for what you've done. You took care of us. We had the worst day of our life, and now you've made it, better. It's not easy, but it's better. So, that's why we do it.
Yes. And to lose stuff is terrible, but to have financial backing is a great assistance. Of course, right now with the flooding in Eastern Kentucky, this is just such a tragedy for sure. And hopefully there will be actually some flood insurance that perhaps we can help them with in the future as they receive FEMA grants and things like that. And if they choose to go with us on the flood insurance, that hopefully for the future, they'll be better off in the event of another bad circumstance. Just a terrible tragedy.
And that is one good thing about FEMA that I'll point out is under FEMA, they have to offer you insurance. So anyone can be insured no matter what. It doesn't matter what flood zone you're in, where you're at, if you've been flooded before or whatever. It's offered to everyone. And I think, which Eastern Kentucky, we've gotten a lot of calls over the last week or two about flood insurance, and there's been a lot of people lost a lot of stuff, and they will be able to purchase flood insurance. I mean, that's one of the, even if they've had a total loss, FEMA will insure them. So that's one good thing about the FEMA, the National Flood Act.
One of the main differences between the NFIP and the private flood insurance is that we've kind of hit around it, but we don't really mention it, is that NFIP will offer, they don't cancel you if you had a flood. Now they will offer you a renewal. It's a guarantee. It's a very stable program. That's what it was made for. It was for stability and assurance. I mean, these policies are backed by the good faith of the FEMA program. A lot of independent agents don't worry when there's a major flood that hits an area, because what happens sometimes in the private carrier market is that, you have an area that's been prone to have some unusual amount of losses. Carriers get nervous and they pull out of those areas and they cancel. So, sometimes when you call your independent agent, and this is what you really need to do, is when you speak to your independent agent, that's what they can do. They can offer you several options, but they need to see, how much risk tolerance you have. I'm not questioning a carrier, because they're billion-dollar carriers and they can pay claims really well. But the NFIP program, which I like it, I've known it to always pay the claims. They do a pretty good job. Now the private carrier market does offer some bells and whistles that are very attractive, but one thing you're going to know is that the NFIP program will provide you with a renewal. You're not going to get canceled if you have, a couple claims. It's really good. And I think there's some price stability as well with that program that you might, which I'm not very familiar with the private insurance market for flood. Danny's a little bit more familiar with it than I am, but one of the things is sometimes if you have people who have a low risk tolerance and they want stability and they feel comfortable with that, that's one of the things that you can mention to them. But that's what you get when you call an independent agent. We're here to evaluate your risk and how much you can tolerate, and then give you some options and help you make the choice.
Yeah, I think the sweet spot for the private flood carriers, I've done quite a bit of it lately. I've really worked on educating myself on it and doing some quotes and things. I think where they really shine is that mid-level risk, if that makes sense. So, you got your worst flood zone, let's call it a flood zone Z. You got your best, we'll call it A. So they really fall in between on that, let's say J or K, that the mid risk level, that's where they're really, really good at. I have ran into cases where some banks will not accept private flood insurance. It's I haven't really sat down and talked to them and asked them why, but I have ran into, and I've provided all the jackets, the policy jackets, and so forth. But for whatever reason, some of the larger banks tend not to accept it. West Virginia, I can't speak on behalf of Kentucky, but you don't see nowhere near the flooding and stuff. Okay, Pikeville, Kentucky, Eastern Kentucky, yes. When you get around Lexington or Richmond and things like that, you don't see it as much. But here in West Virginia, I've had some banks that would not accept the private flood market.
Some of these larger banks are probably worried about being in compliance with like the FDIC.
Yep.
They require banks to, protect the collateral or depositors' money. And there's some ambiguity when it comes to some of these new private flood carrier markets. Like the private flood, the definition of flood has to be as broad as the NFIP program, and then they put in some reassurances to help make some of these banks feel a little bit better. I think it was in 2019, the Bigger Waters Act kind of tried to help clear some of this up. But there's still some banks probably a little bit apprehensive, but I can understand why.
Yeah, for sure.
How who determines what is a flood zone, and how often does that change? If a location floods for the first time, does it get defined then as a flood zone? And if a place hasn't flooded in 200 years or 100 years, is it no longer defined as a flood zone? How does that get determined? Who does that?
That's a good question. And not, again, I think 1968 FEMA, that's when they introduced the flood maps, and it all had to go in compliance with the National Flood Insurance Act and with the banking and things like that. These flood maps do get reevaluated so often, and it's more along the lines of, you're right, as far as there's some history involved in it. There's some the proximity to waters, rivers, typically things like that play a big part of that. Over the the 10 years I've been here, I've seen the map, I think, and Michael maybe answer this better, but I think I've seen it changed once, where they came in and actually redone all the mapping. Sometimes it helps, sometimes it doesn't. But yeah, it's just one of those things that it does, risk does matter where you're located. Elevation, of course, which why you have elevation certificates. So yeah, but I have also seen, addresses that never flood have horrible flood zone ratings, and I don't really have an answer for that.
Some of the rating and some of the changes can be affected by local governments who, for example, Lexington has got several teams that work on water flow here in the town, and over history, they've improved in some of the areas of towns that have flooded in the past are flooding less now because of management of that water, and they are allowed to then to petition for changing the rating for the particular neighborhoods that they're talking about, and that can happen. And sometimes that goes back to where we have had to request elevation certificates for specific homes that we were aware of. In fact, I've got a client who actually is an engineer, and he says, "I'm worried that this street has been worked on, and I'm gonna order a fresh certificate." And then sure enough, it was an advantage for him. He was just a very good guy to work with on that, because he was sharper than I am.
Engineers.
More experience though.
Yeah.
I guess for the listeners and the viewers, we want to make sure they don't have a misconception that they don't need flood insurance if they don't live by a body of water or by a river, right? I mean, that has nothing to do with it, and people should make sure that their home is properly protected and have someone evaluate where they are and make sure that they're properly covered. And that's where you guys come in, right?
That's a good question, and I've had clients call me there's no way, they're nowhere near any risk for flooding per se, bodies of water that want flood insurance. They're interested in flood insurance. It helps them sleep better. And honestly, it's usually very inexpensive for those clients. So yeah, look into it. It's when you get into your risky flood zones, you get into some more premium and stuff. But I've sold flood insurance for $200, $300, $400 a year to people that's in very low risk areas. And there's a little stream maybe close to their home, and there's some things that can happen that can trigger a flood policy to kick in. And my church is one of those. We're not in the flood zone, but we wanted flood insurance, and for different reasons or whatever, it helps us sleep better. We've got a very nice building. It's very old. It's very well maintained, and it's worth a lot of money. And for the price, we decided to buy it. And so yeah, anyone's interested in flood insurance, don't think because you're not near a body of water or you're typically not in an area that floods bad. No, call us, call your agents, let us look at it. Typically, if you're not in one of those extreme flood zones, it's very affordable.
Great.
I was kind of shocked. So I'm from Clendenin, and I remember when
get there from here, can you?
it's a distance. But I remember when the 2016 floods came through Clendenin, I was actually really shocked. So many homes, my brother's house only got just a few inches of water in it. You think of flooding, you think of houses up to the rooftop, underwater. But I think his house only got like 3 or 4 inches of water in it, but it was enough to ruin almost the majority of his main duct line. It was enough to ruin his main feed into his electrical panel. There was several systems throughout his house. And I mean, it was quickly like $40,000 worth of damage that was racked up. And to PG's point a minute ago, I mean, it was an area that hadn't flooded in 100 years or something.
Yep.
They had no record of flooding, but it just took 3 or 4 inches of water to cause, a ridiculous amount of whole, air conditioners switch out, electrical system change out. So
it's astronomical. My parents, we had a flood here in southern West Virginia in 2012, maybe 2012, and my parents there hasn't been a flood where they live in over 100 years. So my dad retired. They paid their home off. They had to have flood insurance because of the loan. They dropped their flood insurance, came through, and like you said, they got 10, 12 inches of water, $62,000.
wow,
That much damage. Yeah.
And there's a problem with water that is similar to fire, of all things. Let's just say that in this scenario, no one is injured and there's just a slight incursion of water. It's inside the house, but it's not washing everything away. The water causes a lot of damage, as a fire would do. With a fire and smoke, you're getting smoke all over the place, so you're getting poisons everywhere. With water, it promotes the growth of bacteria rapidly.
Yep.
And so if you don't have an excellent drying out program and also deep checks of water saturation, your walls can be hiding all sorts of mold buildup, and it can be terrible.
Oh, yeah.
So it does not take a great deal of water inside the home to be so devastating. And sorry to hear about that was your brother, was it, Mike?
yeah.
That's tough. That's tough. But that's a tragedy. And then later it continue to cause breathing problems if it's not been handled properly.
Yeah.
And that can be expensive.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
That's right.
I always tell everyone water claims are the worst claims to have.
Yep.
In my experience, I've had to watch customers deal with them, and they are the worst claims to ever deal with.
So people are concerned if they're clued in a little better now and they understand the need and the urgency of the matter. How do they get in touch with you guys for information on how to get evaluated, have somebody come out, talk to them about flood insurance? What's the best process?
Good question. You can always reach us on our website at www.brayoakley.com. We have social media pages across every platform there. Each one of our locations, which is Pikeville, Kentucky, Richmond, Kentucky, Lexington, Kentucky, Weston, West Virginia, Logan, West Virginia, and Chapmanville, West Virginia. Our phone numbers are available on our website. You can call us. Again, we'll come out, get very personal with it. So we're probably going to come out and look at your home, we'll look at your risk, and we're going to advise you professionally the way we think you need to be insured.